I'll take questions in Spanish later. Thank you so much for the invitation. So, before I take you into the future, future is not 20 years from now. Future is, as you see now. I want to take you to the past. Humans used horses as our main means of transportation for thousands of years. This is New York City, 1900. There is one car in this picture. 1900 New York City. Easter Parade, Fifth Avenue. There, one car. 13 years later, there is one horse in that picture. It only took 13 years, and this is more than a century ago, when technology disruptions did not happen as quickly as now. 13 years, New York went from all horse to all cars. This is a technology disruption. At the time, the technology was the internal combustion engine automobile, which has had a good run for 100 years. But what is a technology disruption? A technology disruption is, or happens, when there is a convergence of, I'll get into it, technologies and business model innovations that make it possible for entrepreneurs and companies to create new products and services that do two things. One is they open up new markets that did not exist, that could not possibly exist before. And two, they either destroy or radically transform existing industries. And both of them are disruptions. So anyone who remembers film cameras, remember those? Those were totally destroyed by digital. So that was a total destruction. And taxis have been also disrupted by technology disruption, Uber and Lyft and Didi and so on, but not destroyed, not yet. And so both are disruptions. And one of the things that come out of disruptions on the other side is growth, economic growth, if you allow it. And this is, of course, we would ask, yes, we can see the destruction, can we see the creation? And this is a picture of 1913, a Ford Motor Company. Where are the jobs that came out of the disruption? Well, here it is. So new growth, new opportunities tend to come out of the early entrepreneurs. And so I'll take you to 85, when the then largest telecom company on earth, AT&T, was wondering whether they should get into this new thing called the cell phone. And of course, they hired McKinsey. They hired an expert, right, to forecast cell phone adoption over the next decade or two. And McKinsey went off and did whatever it is that they do. And their 15-year projection was there's going to be, in the year 2000, 900,000 cell phone subscribers in America, in the US. 900,000. The actual number was 109 million. This is not a small mistake, right? I mean, especially for the money that they charge. This is a factor of 120 times. So it's the experts and the insiders of the existing industries who don't get it, who don't get the disruptions. They get their own industry, they get the equilibrium, but they don't get the disruption, the quick technology disruptions. So what happened with AT&T was, as we know, it's not the current AT&T. AT&T got disrupted. Landline, if anyone of you remembers that, got disrupted. And of course, now we have a multi-trillion-dollar industry, which has been basically one of the largest economic opportunities of the 21st century, that of course those who did not get into the new industries did not participate in. Now, many of these same experts would say, well, how can you know? Well, we do know. We don't know all the details, but we can anticipate disruptions, technology disruptions. So in 2014, 2005, I published a book called Winners Take All. And one of the things I wanted to do was track my predictions, track myself publicly. So I published a portfolio of companies that I thought were disruptive, that would soon emerge and become huge, and so on and so forth. Little companies like Apple and Google and Netflix, Salesforce, and so on and so forth. And not a whole lot of folks paid attention, right? You know how it goes. First they ignore you, then they attack you, and then you win. And then they claim that they knew all along. And so this portfolio has grown by more than $3 trillion since 2004. That is, what, 3 times the GDP of Mexico. So there is a way, at least directionally, for us to know in terms of disruption. And like I said, you know, if you look at what experts were saying about, and mainstream analysts and insiders, about the smartphone in 2007. So iPhone and Android both came out the same year, 2007. And I'm going to ask that question again. Why did both come out 2007, not 2005 or 2009, right? But I'll take you to 2000, and then I'll answer that question. Again, another disruption. In the year 2000, which is more recent, Kodak was doing great. World record in film. World record in everything around film cameras. So what do you think? How do you feel if you're the CEO of Kodak or Fujifilm? You feel great. Everything is up and to the right. Everything is going great. But here I could have another slide that says, where is the digital camera, right? And of course, Kodak, we know the story, how it ended. But the disruption did not take place. I mean, bankruptcy took 12 years. But by 2003-04, Kodak was gone, essentially. The actual disruption happened in 2 years. Again, can you anticipate how quickly that's going to happen? Yes, you can. And so here's the question that I ask myself every day. Why do smart people in smart organizations consistently fail to anticipate, let alone lead, market disruptions? And that's the question that I've been asking myself for a long time as an educator. Can we anticipate disruptions? Now I can tell you without a doubt, yes. So what I've been doing over the last dozen years or so is to develop a framework to see if we can, in fact, anticipate disruptions, technology disruptions. And I'll walk you through some of these elements because it's important that we know how I think and how I wrote Clean Disruption in other works that I'm working on now. So one of the important things is technology cost curves. And these are well-known cost curves, not miracles, not breakthroughs. If those happens, then it would tend to accelerate disruptions. So we all know Moore's Law. It says that in computing, it improves by about 2x every 2 years. So essentially on a per dollar basis. So I'm interested not just in the improvement in technology per se, but on a dollar basis, because at the end of the day, I'm interested in the market. What is going to be successful in the market? So this is an improvement of about 41% per year. And 41% exponential improvement every year adds up to a lot, right? 1,000 times in 20 years, 1,000,000 times in 40, 1,000,000,000 times in 60 years. And so if Moore's Law keeps going, and many experts doubt it, but of course they've been doubting it for 20 years, then essentially this $600 phone would be about 60 cents, right? In about 20 years. 60 cents. What are we going to do with the power of this for 60 cents? So think about it. I mean, that's where we're going, assuming we don't have breakthroughs, such as quantum computing or neural networks and so on. But it's not just Moore's Law. Moore's Law is the best known. There are a lot of technologies that are and have been improving exponential, some exponentially and some not. There are learning curves and experience curves and so on and so forth. And you know, I was an early employee at a then little company called Cisco Systems. And you know, we were looking at how we had to compete and how this internet thing was going to grow. And back then we were looking at several technologies, digital content and so on. And we were looking at, of course, Moore's Law, but we're also looking at data storage, because I think a lot of data is going to move through the pipes. We're looking at digital imaging. We're looking at a lot of these different curves, and they all go at different, and this is one of the things that made it in the past difficult to predict, because they all go at different rates. How do you know, right? So the answer to the question of why did the smartphone happen 2007, does anyone have the answer? Not 2005 and not 2009. It's because of this. One of my key findings is that technology convergence causes the big disruptions. It's not just cost curves of technologies, but the convergence. So it's not deterministic, it's not linear, in other words, it's convergence, right? It becomes a little more complex. So the reason both Google and Apple came up with a smartphone that year, at about the same time, is that the technologies that made a $600 smartphone possible converged that year. So any of 30, 40 companies anywhere around the world could have built a smartphone. Nokia could have done it, remember them? Motorola could have done it, remember them? BlackBerry could have done it, remember them? But it turns out that it was another lesson of disruption. Disruptions happen from the outside. It's usually not the incumbents who disrupt industries. There are exceptions. But in this case, two companies that had never built a phone ever before were the ones who disrupted the industry and now own pretty much 95% of the operating system in the smartphone market. But the key point is that it was a convergence of technologies that made the smartphone possible. And when that happens, in open economies, somebody's going to make it work because there are opportunities. So what are the key technologies that I'm looking at in terms of disruptive capability over the next decade or so? And this is not everything. It's just, you know, I'm just one guy, right? I'm looking at about 13, 14 technologies that in different combinations, in convergence in different times, in different places, different markets, have the potential to disrupt pretty much every large industry. So I'm going to talk about energy and transport today, but you know, one of the things that I'm working on right now that I'm going to publish next year is the disruption of the cow. The cow, you heard it right. So how can that happen with technology? Well, it's going to be a convergence again. So you can analyze pretty much every large industry in terms of convergence of technologies. The other very important point in the technology disruption framework is that adoption. And this is key. And the concept of the S-curve is key in how quickly disruptions can happen. So in the beginning, you see very, I mean, even if it goes quickly, you say, oh, it's below 1%, oh, it's below 2%. I mean, how quickly, please, are they going to get to 80% or whatnot? So the S-curve explains essentially all adoptions, successful product adoptions in history. I mean, not just a few, all of them. So this is an example of adoption of color TV in the US. So initially you see it doesn't look like much, and then boom, it tips, and within just a few years, it disrupts everything else. So the key as policymakers, as investors, as CEOs and so on, is to get in right before the tipping point, or get out if you're going to be disrupted, right? But how do you know the tipping point? And that's the key, right? Because as soon as that happens, if you're not in the industry, you're out. Because adoption happens exponentially and you have to be there. And when you're there, basically it's all about scaling at that point. But of course, transportation and energy are not TVs, right? And they're not cell phones. So I went back to the beginning, the 1900 time frame, to look at cars versus horses. And here's what we found. We found that the whole adoption of cars in the US took about to 95%, not just in New York, but in the whole United States, took about 20 years, which the whole United States, to 95% of miles coming from cars. Now, another interesting fact about disruptions, metrics change. So if you're going to, measuring the new market with old metrics is going to get you in trouble. So what used to work before doesn't necessarily work. So the car market share in terms of passenger miles in the US went from zero about to 95% of miles in cars in about 20 years. But here's the most interesting thing. From 11% to 80%, so it tipped at about 11% in around 1908, to 80%, which is the exponential growth, happened in just 11 years. Just 11 years, and then it's over. But this is even more interesting. It happened in 11 years, and in that time, we built two whole new industries from scratch. The car industry and the oil industry. Neither one of them existed. We built a whole new road infrastructure, which did not exist before. And we fought World War I. We did all that, and the disruption still took 10 years, 11 years. So anybody who tells you a disruption in transportation cannot happen in 10 years, 11 years, is not looking at the evidence. This is data. Right? It's not emotions, it's data. And even more than 100 years ago, it took just 11 years. And when you look at S-curves from 1900 to now, they're getting faster and steeper and steeper. I mean, it used to take 10 years, 20 years, even 30 years. Now it all goes like this. I mean, in 2 years, it's over. I mean, if you look at the adoption of the smartphone, I mean, does anyone not have a smartphone? I mean, the smartphone came out 11 years ago. Now, pretty much, it's almost 100% market penetration worldwide. Not just, in the US, not just in the Americas, worldwide. I mean, I went to India not long ago. They have a $30 smartphone now, $30. With free data, right? I mean, even within the smartphone industry, there's disruptions within the industry, right? But everything is happening so quickly. After the smartphone, the tablet or Facebook, or things are happening very quickly. And yet, when you look at the mainstream analysts, you see that they still have these linear projections. So in solar, and I'm going to come back to that, the installed base of solar energy worldwide since 2000 has been growing at 40% or so every year, every single year. since 2000. It's been doubling every 2 years, right? And every year, the EIA, the IEA, and most mainstream analysts go back and say, oh, it grew 40%. All right, I'll just do a linear kind of projection. And then it grows 40%, and they do another linear projection. So as if it was going to slow down as solar gets cheaper. In what market does it happen that when a product gets cheaper, adoption slows down? How insane is that? So essentially what these mainstream analysts are doing, whether they're doing it on purpose or not, is linear projections, silo. So they look at one industry, oil or gas or cars or whatever, but everything is connected. It's all technology disruption. And they look back. Whatever they say is a projection is actually, they go back, they look at how it's grown, and then every year they move up their line by whatever the market grew. And really, they don't take into account business model innovation, they don't take into account product innovation, they don't take any of that into account. So most of the forecasts that you see are actually forecasting the past, not the present. They just move up their little line and give you whatever emotional, and even policy. And some folks say, oh, but policy doesn't move quickly. Well, I again went back to the horse and the car in the United States and looked at the gasoline tax. First state to adopt gasoline, which was a new innovation at the time, policy innovation. Oregon, February 19, passed the first gasoline tax law. And within 6 years, 91% of US states had adopted that policy. How cool is that for policy? And every US state adopted it within 10 years. So even policy innovations, which are a form of disruption, get adopted as S-curves. Not a pretty S-curve, but an S-curve nonetheless. So last one, big important thing is business model innovation. It's as important as technology innovation. So a lot of us look at solar coming down in cost and lithium ion, but business model innovation can be hugely disruptive. So if you look at Uber, for instance, Uber is not a technology innovation. It's a business model innovation. Uber took the cloud and the smartphone and essentially created a new business model that was enabled by that convergence to disintermediate taxis, a very inefficient industry. And by the way, a lot of these disruptions are about inefficiencies, exploiting inefficiencies in the market. So Uber is a business model innovation. Now, it's not coincidental that Uber got started in San Francisco 2 years after the smartphone came out, after the iPhone came out. 2 years. It's not coincidental because the smartphone is what made ride-hailing possible. And again, within 7 years, so they were started 2009, and by the end of 2016, Uber had more bookings than the whole taxi industry in the United States. A little company that got started in an apartment in 2009. Talk about a disruption, right? And they don't own any cars. They don't own, anything other than computers. So again, anyone who tells you that a disruption in transportation cannot happen in 7 years is not looking at the evidence. And today, 25% of all vehicle kilometers in San Francisco are Uber and Lyft. 20% from zero, right? Not 10 years ago. That's a disruption in process. In New York City, it's 50%. 50%, not of all vehicle miles traveled, but the other point about transportation. In New York City, it's ride-hailing is 50% of individual ownership miles. So if I own my car and I drive into the city, Uber today is 50% of that. Talk about a disruption, right? And one of the things that are happening in the US that have happened is peak car ownership. It's already here. So last year, 2017, 10% of individuals who brought in their cars back to the dealer did not buy a new one. 10%. Basically, folks are giving up on car ownership already to get on ride hailing and so on and so forth. I don't own a car. I've not owned a car in 10 years. And you know, I've done the numbers, financials, and it's insane how much we spend in cars. But here's the point. Peak car ownership is already here. And a lot of companies were betting on China, for instance, as growth market. It's peaking there also. So this is not just an isolated phenomenon. So business model innovation is every bit as disruptive as a technology innovation. So with that as background, basically these are the main elements of the technology disruption framework. You know, I went off and I wrote Clean Disruption to essentially prove or disprove whether this worked or not. So essentially I set out to say, okay, how does this technology disruption framework apply to energy and transportation? Does it? So I wrote that book. And the executive summary is this. There are four technologies and one business model innovation that they're all disruptive separately, but together they are super disruptive, and together they're going to disrupt all of energy and transportation, and the disruption is over by 2030. Now, I made this claim 4 years ago, right? 4.5 years ago. By 2030, it's over. It's not starting in 2030, it's over, right? So what did I base? What was the logic of what I said? So I started with the battery, lithium-ion batteries. And you know, at the time, batteries had been, so for 15 years, but lithium-ion batteries, which is what we use in computers and what we use in cell phones and so on, were, for about 15 years, they improved at 14% per year, right? And then in 2010, they accelerated to 16%. So by the time I looked at it, I'm like, okay, so it's improving at 16%. What if it keeps improving at 16%, right? And of course, at the time, what did the mainstream analysts tell me? You're insane. It's not going to improve by 16%. But let's assume that it did. So this was my projection in 2014. And I have not updated it because the point that I'm making here is not that I'm right. It's to see if this model works, right? So in 2014, it was around $500 per kilowatt hour. And at 16%, essentially it said, by 2020, it's going to be $170 per kilowatt hour. Not bad, right? And folks said, you're crazy, you're insane, not going to happen. Well, they were right. It does actually accelerated, right? They said, no, 16, no, it's going to be 3-4%. Now, what did happen was that in 2014, we had only 3 major lithium-ion factories. And at the time, another person who got called insane was, of course, Elon Musk, who, when he announced the Gigafactory, he was told, there's not going to be a market for that much lithium-ion batteries. And by the end of 2017, essentially that had grown by 6.5 times. 6.5 times in just 3 years. And of course, the cost curve went up to 20% per year. So there were, mainstream analysts were right for the wrong reason. It actually accelerated, and I thought it would accelerate because it tends to happen when industry adoption goes up. And you know, basically, you know, that's me, by the way, that picture, the geeky-looking guy with that's me in South Korea visiting a Samsung SDI lithium-ion battery. And Dyson has announced that they're going to make an electric car. Dyson, Dyson, I mean, they make vacuum cleaners, right? Isn't making a car difficult? Don't you need like 100 years of, precision manufacturing and so on experience? Well, not really. Oh, yes, if you're going to build an internal combustion engine automobile, but no, if you're going to build an electric vehicle. And I'll go into that. But Dyson is actually investing 2 billion pounds to basically come up with electric cars in 2 years, by 2020. And another point in batteries as to how they are already disrupting the market, the power market. In Australia, Tesla built a 129 megawatt hour battery, which is only 2% of the capacity of the FCAC, right, market, and so it's a tiny percent of a tiny market. It's only South Australia. But here's the interesting thing, which is a big lesson of disruption. That battery is only 2% of the capacity of that market, and yet it has gathered 55% market share, and it took out 90% of the revenues out of the system. Now, I want you to think about that, because a lot of what the mainstream analysts will tell you is it's going to take a long time before batteries or solar or EVs, I mean, fill in the blank, gets to 80% or 50% and so on. Not true, but let's assume that it was. It doesn't take that high a market penetration for a disruptive product to bankrupt an industry. And that's the thing that you need to think about if you're an incumbent. A battery with only 2% of the market wiped out 90% of the revenues from the system. So if you're the incumbent, you're gone. Imagine basically this new thing taking 90% of the market. It didn't have to be 20, 50, or 80% market penetration. By that time, it's already over. Does this make sense? So when I say by 2030 it's over, yes, it's over, totally over, but the bankruptcy of the existing industry will happen a lot before that. And it won't take a big market penetration for that to happen. And that's very important. So again, this is because the impact of disruptive products and services is disproportional. It's non-linear, okay? Now, you've heard about this is a phenomenon that I've studied, complexity, complex systems that feed on itself and so on and so forth. You've probably heard about the fires in California, right? Worst fires ever in recorded history. Now, why did they happen now? And why so easily? It took just a spark to light up the worst fires in history in California. Just one spark. Why? Because we had a combination, a convergence of the factors that would make a fire possible. And at that point, all you need is a spark. And that's how disruptions happen. So the phenomena are similar. They're non-linear. Does that make sense? So the impact of disruptive products and services in energy and transportation are non-linear. They're disproportional. Only a 2% market penetration can wipe out 90% of the market. So this is how batteries are going to disrupt the grid. Okay, or are disrupting the grid already in several places. Why? The grid is a just-in-time supply chain. Essentially, when we turn on these lights, at this very microsecond, there's a power plant that just generated that electricity. So we overbuild capacity. in the power markets, by about 2x, because we have to have enough capacity for the peak. A lot of industries are built for the peak, not for average. So what happens is that batteries, when you can store, you flatten the demand. And so in power markets, when you flatten both the demand and the supply, by the way, it wipes out that excess capacity. So the graph that I'm showing is from New York, from the New York, Con Edison, New York. And there's a lot of capacity there that is only used about 6% at most of the year. Billions of dollars in assets that are used only a few hours every year for those moments in the summer. So a third of those assets are going to be wiped out because of batteries quickly. Does this make sense? Batteries are going to disrupt first ancillary services like they have in Australia already, then the peak, and then baseload, because they're going to flatten the demand. I showed Australia. Now in California, they approved the largest battery systems ever, which is 17 times larger than the one in Australia. Again, this is exponential growth. It's not 17% larger, it's 17 times larger than the one in Australia. And that's how markets happen. When markets tip, they just scale. And batteries now, you can't buy them. Batteries over the next few years are going to grow as fast as the market can supply them, because they're already financially viable. And the CEO of NextEra Energy says after 2020, he said this a few years ago, now he says there may not be another peaker ever built in the United States because of the combination of mostly batteries, also solar and wind. One prediction that I can make happily is that as battery costs come down, as they have and that they will continue, every house, every business, every factory, every mall, every hospital will have batteries connected to each other and to the grid. They will at least have batteries, and regulation will determine whether they're connected to the grid. They should be, but they'll do it because it makes economic sense. Now, because batteries are coming down in cost so quickly, there's another disruption. So again, all of these things are connected. The EV disruption. And the first question, are EVs disruptive? Or are they just a nice kind of alternative to Porsche and Ferrari and so on and so forth? And by the way, did you know that last quarter, Tesla sold more cars than Porsche? Yeah? How cool is that? A year ago, people were saying that Tesla was on the verge of bankruptcy. Right? What are they saying? It's such a great company. Yeah? They sold more cars than Porsche last quarter. And by the end of next year, they'll be larger in revenues than Porsche, a company that did not exist 10 years ago. Now, are EVs disruptive, or are they nice to have? Are they nice, green, and climate friendly, and so on? So let me run you through a few things. One, EVs are 10 times cheaper once you buy them to charge on a per kilometer basis versus gasoline, 10 times. Also, here's why Dyson is making EVs, or is going to make EVs, and not just Dyson, right? An internal combustion engine, your car, assuming you don't have an EV, has 2,000 moving parts, not parts, moving parts. An EV has 20. That's it. An EV is it's like a computer. It's a massive battery with a few motors, and you're done. And Dyson knows about massive batteries and motors and so on, right? Now, here's something that not a whole lot of people have talked about. EVs can last 800,000 kilometers. And Tesla is building the 1.6 million kilometer EV. Now, try that with your gasoline car. I mean, gasoline, so even 800,000 kilometers is about 3 to 5 times, 2.5 times more than gasoline cars. And of course, we drive about, 16,000 kilometers per year. So why would we want a 800,000 kilometer car? I mean, it would take, 50 years to drive that car to the end. Who drives a car for 50 years? Unless you live in Cuba, right? Just saying. But let alone 1 million miles, right? So I'll come back to that. But yeah, Tesla has already announced, and this is one of the things that I predicted, that the million-mile EV would come soon. And of course, I was told that I was insane. But EVs, by the way, did I mention they have a huge battery? They can store 2 full days of electricity of the average American home, which I understand we consume about 5 times more than the average Mexican home, which means that an EV, a 320 kilometer EV, can store, 10 days of electricity of the average Mexican home. 10 days, right? Try that with your, Nissan, with your VW diesel, right? 10 days. Now, how is that important? Well, it's important because it can stabilize the grid, right? So EVs can be used to stabilize the grid. EVs can be used to provide resilience because our power system has single points of failure. You have one transmission line. If that transmission line goes, the whole city goes, right? You need resilience. I mean, if you're a manufacturing operation, you can't afford that. You have to have a day or two of storage, period, right? So EVs can provide resilience to the grid. And so it's not just a one-to-one substitute for gasoline vehicles. And the cost is coming down. And the cost of EVs, because the main element, which is the battery, the most expensive one, has come down in cost by 16 to 20%. And again, this is the prediction I made in 2014 with Clean Disruption. I have not changed it. And back then, I predicted that by this time, the end of 2018, we would have several cars in the $35,000 to $40,000 range, several EVs with 320 kilometer range. How's that for an accurate prediction? Okay? And I was told you're insane, and I'm still told you're insane, right? But for other reasons. And so how's that for accuracy? And this market is accelerating. If any one of you has any doubt, I suggest you go to China. There are more than 200 EV companies in China. 200, not 1, not 5, 200. Okay? How many car companies were there in Detroit in the early 1900s? Does anyone know? 200, right? That's what China has today. It's an amazing thing to see. China in automotive today is what Detroit was 100 years ago. All of these technologies are global. Batteries, EVs, and so on and so forth. So this is accelerating. Now, if this prediction keeps coming true as it has over the last 5 years, by 2020, we will have electric vehicles with 200-mile range. Now, why am I saying 200-mile range? Because assuming that we still keep the individual ownership model of us owning a car and driving to work and all that, which I'm going to tell you later is not going to happen. The minimum that consumers would need is 320 kilometer range. By 2020, EVs with 200-mile range will be cheaper than gasoline cars The average gasoline car in America today is $34,000. So we're going to have EVs, which are 10 times cheaper to fuel. They last 10 times as much. They can store electricity. They're more powerful. I mean, what do you think people are going to buy? It makes total economic sense. Not because they're green, but because of, let's see, do I have a green? Yeah, but because of this green. People are going to make the rational economic choice. And that's 2020. That's only 2 years away. And if that cost curve keeps going, and there's no reason why it shouldn't, you're going to have, by 2025, $10,000 EVs with 320-kilometer range and less. I already saw the $10,000 in China. I mean, it's already there, right? I'm talking about no subsidy. It's happening as we speak. So if I'm right, by 2025, no mainstream company will build a gasoline vehicle, period. Not a car, not a bus, not a tractor, not a period. And this is assuming a one-to-one substitution, which as I said, is not going to happen. And this is the numbers. Look at the numbers. Now, the disruption in transportation is going to come because of something else. So ride-hailing, I mentioned. Electric vehicles, I mentioned. Now, let me tell you about autonomous vehicles. And let me show you one video, and then I'll come back. This is Waymo, a Google company. So this is formerly known as Google, and this is happening today. They're commercial today in Phoenix, Arizona, and they're expanding into other markets in the US and also the UK. No driver, not even safety driver. This is level 4 autonomous vehicles. Level 4. 4 means you don't need a driver at all. You can sleep in the car. Okay, you can see this online. Waymo ordered 62,000 vans that are going to be essentially autonomous. This is not just an R&D project. This is not just a research project. They ordered 62,000 vans to essentially expand that market. And just to give you an idea, 62,000 autonomous vehicles would provide about 10% of the passenger miles in Arizona, assuming that they only do Arizona. 10%. And this is hugely disruptive, right? And it's not just Google, it's dozens of companies investing in. Every day you can see all the new announcements. This is old. The new announcements of companies investing tens of billions of dollars in electrification and also in autonomous technology. Large companies. This is not just Silicon Valley anymore. I mean, when I published my book, autonomous vehicles were out there, right? Not anymore. Now it's pretty mainstream. And here's another thing that's important for you to understand. These cars are computers on wheels. No driver, right? Big battery. And a computer is driving it, not a human. These are computers on wheels. If we look at the history of technology, of computing, there's been two operating systems that essentially you need. You need one operating system. So Apple did not wait for anyone before they came up with the iPhone, right? As soon as iOS was ready, they went to market. And then came Google with the second operating system. And those two operating systems own 95% of the market. You may have a third, maybe, but in computer markets, because of the network effects, all you need is one operating system, and then you're off to the races. And only two will survive. Windows and Mac, right? iOS and Android, and so on and so forth. Maybe you have a third, Linux, for instance, right? Unix, and so on. But by and large, all you need is one. All you need is one. So you have a lot of quote-unquote experts who are saying, oh, it's going to be another 10, 15 years before we even have autonomous technology. Well, maybe. You're going to be the BlackBerry and the Nokia, right? Because as soon as one, it's like a spouse, right? It's like a wife or a husband. All you need is one, right? And you're off to the races. We don't need 20 companies to have, operating systems for autonomous technology. All we need is one. And we don't need level 5. We'll get there at some point. So that's another methodology that, we may never get to level 5. That doesn't matter. All we need is level 4, like that car. Now, what about the cost? So here's what an autonomous car sees. It uses LiDAR, laser, radar. It shoots it out 100 to 200 meters, 360 degrees, 1 million laser pulses per second. And they bounce back like a radar. And then, the computer builds this beautiful real-time simulation. This is superhuman. I mean, we don't, this is way beyond us. Some of these technologies actually can see around the corner, which is, if you think of the radar, it makes sense, right? So what are the technology cost curves? When Google first announced the cost of its LiDAR, it was $70,000, twice the cost of the car. And what did the mainstream analysts say? This is not going to happen. That is too expensive. But basically, by over the last few years, we've seen Silicon Valley companies bring it down first to 10,000, and then to 1,000. So there's a friend of mine who's CEO of this company called Quanergy, and they already sell a $1,000 LiDAR. Not bad. 70 times improvement. That's the technology cost curve. So if you need one, then it's $1,000. It's not bad. I mean, it's like getting a bigger wheel or getting a different kind of metallic paint or whatever. But wait, there's more, right? The $250 LiDAR, I've seen it. It's about this big. Essentially, it's out there being tested. It's not in the market yet. But $250. So even if you have 4, essentially it's $1,000. So that technology, and the next one, by the way, is the size of a postage stamp, and it's going to cost $90, right? What are entrepreneurs going to do with a $90 LiDAR? Okay, entrepreneurs in the crowd, you will know, right? But this is going to open up a whole new set of business models and products and so on. Now, this is the Fisker eMotion, which is autonomous and electric, and it's supposed to come out in 2020. It has 5 LiDARs. Can you see them? Where is the LiDAR? And when I saw this, actually the CEO of the company said, can you tell me where the 5 LiDARs are? And I'm like, it sounds like one of my presentations, right? And actually, I actually knew where they were, and he said I was the only one who did. They're hidden. They're like here, in the lights, and you can't see them. You don't have that big hat that says, I'm a self-driving car, hit me, right? So price is not an issue, and the other very important thing is that, again, autonomous technology is an operating system. If it works for a car, it's going to work for a truck, it's going to work for a bus, and so on. Like an operating system that works for an iPhone, it works for an iPad, and so on and so forth. So you'll see announcements from Google and others about autonomous being brought to trucking. And it actually makes more sense for commercial vehicles than it does for personal vehicles. Why? Because 2/3 of the cost of trucking, 1/3 is labor, and 1/3 is energy. So if electric saves 10x, it saves about 28-30% of energy bills, and autonomous would save on labor bills, right? So it makes a lot of sense for truck companies to use both electric and autonomous. And look at this. This is someone, somewhere, driving a remote car. So what are we going to do with last kilometer kind of thing where traffic is insane and there are people crossing and this and that? Well, we get there, we can have someone remotely driving the car or the truck. That technology we've had for decades. Actually, it's not even new. Okay, now, cool. So autonomous technology, we're going to be able to Facebook and Instagram and tweet and all that while we not drive. How's the disruption going to happen? So remember the 2007 disruption convergence of the iPhone and Android? It's going to be a convergence of technologies. And the convergence is three things: electric vehicles, ride-hailing, meaning on demand, and autonomous. So imagine Ubers without a driver and electric. And by the way, before I tell you that, just a reminder that cars are the middle class's largest, other than the house, capital expenditure, but we only use it 4% of the time. 4%. It's 96% of the time parked, or in Mexico City on the highway, right? Which is a big parking lot, right? Mexico City, the difference between a highway and a parking lot, not quite, no boundaries. So here's the disruption. So when you put all of this together, essentially, did I tell you EVs can go 500,000 miles? An Uber drives about 100,000 miles per year. So a person doesn't, but a fleet car, a taxi, or an Uber does. So if an Uber, over 5 years, assume that they or somebody else buys a car for 5 years, they would need to buy one EV or 2.5 gasoline cars, right? So over 5 years, it already makes more sense for an Uber to be electric than it does to be a gasoline car because of the number of miles. So when you put all of this together, essentially, it's all about numbers, right? The cost of what we call transportation as a service, which is electric, autonomous, and on-demand, is going to be 10 times cheaper than the cost of individual ownership of gasoline cars. 10 times cheaper. Now, so transport as a service, just to be clear, is on-demand, autonomous and electric, owned by fleets, not individuals, owned by fleets, the Ubers and the taxis and so on and so forth. On day one, when autonomous technology is ready and approved by the regulators, let's assume it's 2021, let's assume that car from Waymo is ready and approved in 3 years. That day, the cost per kilometer, now remember, metrics change. The cost per kilometer of a task vehicle is going to be 10 times cheaper than the cost per kilometer of individually owned cars. 10x has always caused a disruption. I'll repeat, a 10x difference in cost for the same product or service has always caused a disruption. Every single time in history. Now, I've only looked at history until 1454. So I haven't looked at all of history, but in the last 400 or 500 years, Every time we've had a 10x, we've seen a disruption. So on the day, let's assume it's 2021. It could be 2022 or 3. Let's assume it's 2021. 10x. So essentially, you're going to go and buy a car, a new car. Your decision is going to be this one. Do I spend $50,000 over the next 5 years in buying and owning gasoline, insurance, all that stuff, a car, $50,000, or do I spend $100 per month in an Uber or Lyft subscription? No brainer. That has always caused a disruption every single time. So folks are going to stop buying new cars. It doesn't mean they're going to get rid of their cars, but they're going to stop buying new cars for purely economic reasons. And TaaS is going to be 4 times cheaper than operating a car that you already own. So if your uncle gives you a car, the cost of operating that car are going to be 4 times more expensive than the cost of TaaS. So you may not get rid of it right away, but when you do, you're not buying a new car. So you feed that data into the simulation, and what we get for the United States is that 95% of miles will be TaaS, autonomous electric on demand, by 2030. 95% of miles, which means only, now this doesn't mean 95% of cars, by the way. We'll still see that of the remaining cars, 40% are going to be individually owned. But individuals only drive 10,000 miles a year. And fleets drive 100,000, so they will contribute 95% of all the miles. And all you need is a few companies to tip the balance. DiDi has already said that by 2020, again, in 2 years, they expect to have 1 million EVs in their fleet. 1 million EVs. And I did the numbers. This is about a third of all the passenger miles driven in California, or half of all the miles in Canada, for instance, just 1 million EVs. So here's the implications. What are the implications of all of this? The vehicle fleet shrinks by 80% because we don't need as many cars. Because if one car goes 100,000 miles, basically it can take 10 times the number of people. We don't need that many cars. 80% fewer cars on the road. What else goes when this goes? Traffic goes, right? Because you have fewer vehicles. If you're in the car industry, you're not going to like this. Shrinks. Demand for new car is going to shrink by 70%. Because people are going to stop buying cars, and fleets are going to buy more cars rather than individuals. What about oil? So the implication of this is that oil is going to peak 2020, or essentially right before autonomous technology is adopted anywhere, right? So we did the US, but in fact, if it's adopted in China or if it's adopted in Europe, it doesn't matter. As soon as it's adopted anywhere, we see that oil is going to peak the year before at 100 million barrels per day, and it's going to go down to 70 million by 2030. So it's not so fast in terms of volume going down. But what happens, as you know, with oil, as we saw in 2014 and 15, all you need in oil markets, again, in pricing, it's disproportional. We only had a 2 million barrel oversupply in 2014-15, and prices crashed, right, from 100 to 20 or so. So we see that imbalance basically happening again by about 2021 or 2. So even though volume is going to go down like this, prices are going to crash immediately because of that oversupply. 2-3 million barrels, that's all that you're going to need. That's nothing. That's 2-3% of the market. You don't need that many EVs on the road for that to happen. So what does that mean immediately? By the early 2020s is that Expensive oil that can't compete at 25, which would be the equilibrium price, basically are gone. They're financially unviable. So oil sands, Canada, gone. Deep water, gone. And shale, gone. None of these can compete at 25. Oils that can't compete at 25 basically are going to become stranded assets. Conventional is fine, because conventional can produce at 10 or 5 or whatever. If it can't compete at 25 or so, I mean, it may be 20, it may be 30. One oil executive, CEO of a major oil company, told me, I'm getting ready for $15 a barrel. So they've done the numbers more deeply than I did. Big implications. Our cities are going to be essentially the middle class. Anyone who owns a car and goes to transport as a service is going to save $6,000 a year. $6,000 a year by not owning a car. In the US, this translates to $1 trillion of money in our pockets, consumer spending. And productivity by us not driving and instead doing whatever we do in a car, tweeting or this or that, that's a productivity increase of not tweeting, but you know what I mean, $1 trillion additional dollars. So the economy goes up by 15%. Social, basically transportation is going to be 10 times cheaper. This means that a 10-mile ride is going to be essentially $1. $1. 10 miles. So essentially you can give away free transportation. In fact, companies will give away transportation to attract people to their shops and to their bars and stuff because it's so cheap. Now this also means that essentially everyone will have access to cheap, reliable, and convenient transportation. Environment, 90% decrease in CO2 emissions. 90% decrease. Now, this is not what's driving the disruption. This is an implication from the disruption. I mean, we're going to have 90% less CO2, and we're going to get back $1 trillion a year as consumers. How cool is that? We're going to get paid for this. The mythology that going to zero carbon is going to be expensive is just that, the mythology. The data says otherwise. Traffic accidents, we kill 1 million people every year. That's a disgrace. When we have AEVs, that's going to go down dramatically, right? If not zero. And of course, did I mention that electric vehicles are big batteries? Even if they're operated 10, 12 hours a day, that still leaves another 12 to 14 hours for them to plug into the grid and provide grid services. Right? Solar, wind, and so on. And so you're going to have a massive battery infrastructure. And the other major implication is that parking is going to be obsolete. Why would you need parking, which we use 90% of the time now, when there's no individual ownership? Cars are going to be going round and round, round and round and round, not parked, which is such a waste of space. And a lot of cities, especially the ones that were built in the 20th century, about a third of the landmass of those cities is parking. So I did the numbers for Los Angeles, and basically my numbers say that in the free parking space, the space that is going to be freed up by transport as a service, you can build 3 cities the size of San Francisco. 3 San Franciscos can go in just the parking that is going to be unlocked by essentially the parking that's going to be useless. So think about that. I mean, everyone who lives in a city is going to have to start planning for a future where a third or whatever of the landmass of the city is going to open up. And we need to make the decisions. What do we want? I mean, what city do we want to be when we grow up? because this is the biggest disruption in terms of space in cities. Do we want green space? Well, check, yes. Do we want more businesses? Well, yeah, check. Do we want more affordable housing? Well, check, yes. So we're going to have a lot of landmass, and on top of that, a lot of parking in houses and in buildings are going to open up also. What do we do with that? More offices, more housing, cheap housing, and so on and so forth. So essentially, our cities are going to be redesigned over the next 10 years. I mean, this is not 2050. This is the next 10 years. And I'm running out of time. I already did. I'll walk you quickly through the how do we power all of this, right? And so solar and wind, but especially solar, is already wiping out everything else. And has anyone been to Denmark lately? Copenhagen? No. Okay. Copenhagen has a school that it's way north, right? It's north of Juneau, Alaska, just to give you an idea. The international school in Copenhagen generates 50% of its electricity, annual electricity, using solar. Copenhagen, Denmark. This is not, Mexico or Arizona. Any excuse that you can't generate a lot of energy with solar goes out the window, right? And by the way, can you see where the solar is? Can you see where the solar is? It's the walls. It's the walls, right? It's beautiful. So solar is, another one of these. The cost curve has been since since the 70s. It's come down since 1970 by 300 times in cost. So it goes down by about 22% with every doubling of infrastructure. And to the end of 2017, the installed base went up by 300 times since the year 2000. So it's doubled every 2 years since the year 2000. Now it's about 1.5% of world generation, which is why mainstream analysts go like, oh, we still need to put up coal and this and that, because how quickly can you go from 1% or 2%? Well, we've seen that before, right? And if all you do is double, if that's all you do, which is not what's going to happen, from about 1.5% today, how many years would it be? Right? 1.5%, double it, 3%, 6, 12%, 24%, 48, 96. It would only take 6 more doublings for solar to be 96% of world energy. World energy, right? And that's 12 years, 2030. Now, I'm going to tell you why it's going to happen more quickly. Now, not just at that rate. Take any form of conventional energy, oil, gas, nukes, coal, whatever. They've all gone up in price since 1970 by 6 to 16 times. Nukes actually much more than that. They're resources, right? I mean, you have to dig them out and blah, blah, blah. Oil at 50. If you compare the solar improvement by 300 times to oil at 50, solar has improved by about 5,000 times relative to oil, and 4,000 relative to nukes, and so on and so forth. Solar is a technology, it's going to keep improving, right? So the thing about grid parity, which is the cost of unsubsidized solar on the rooftop, it's already cheaper than pretty much anything today. Today, I mean, this is not in the future. If I put it up on my rooftop, it's cheaper than whatever the electric company can give me, right? I mean, we already passed 80% in 2017. And this is why about 69% of corporations are looking to buy solar right now. This is not in the future, this is right now. Because, again, of green. Not because they want to be green, but because of pure money. And because of this, because it makes economic sense, we can see an S-curve acceleration. So I invented a new term for this. just to show the idea of when it's going to tip, because since 1970, that's a long time. So I call it God parity, generation on demand parity. So what that means is this: solar on the rooftop in many markets already, and in all markets it will be cheaper than the cost of transmission. Transmission, even if you can generate at zero, even if you bring, fusion, right, which is 30 years away and has always been, even if you generate at zero, when you add transmission, it'll be more expensive than solar on the rooftop. That's what I call God parity. And most markets are already there. Do the numbers. Australia is way below that. In Australia, 6 cents for rooftop solar unsubsidized, 12 cents for transmission. It's already gone, right? Australia has 25% home solar, 25% market penetration. Why not 100? Well, batteries, right? And batteries are now at the point that once you get that convergence, which is going to happen 2020, 2021, that market is going to tip. Boom, right? So that's God parity. And even if you add storage plus solar, distributed is going to be dramatically cheaper than transmission. So essentially what that says is that everyone, every business, every mall, every manufacturing operation will go solar because it has to, because it can't compete otherwise. It's not a matter of green. Again, it's a matter of green. And solar is getting to the point of 4 or 5 cents already. And in 2014, I said, by 2020, rooftop solar is going to be 4 or 5 cents. And of course, I was told I was insane. It already is, okay? 4 or 5 cents. No subsidies, right? Solar, so of course, we can't generate everything we need in cities and so on from solar, right? We still have the nighttime, and it may not be sunny enough and so on. We're still gonna need large-scale generation in many cities, especially in the north and so on, and south and so on. So we'll need transmission and distribution and all that. We have large data centers, we have aluminum smelters and so on and so forth. Now, what are we going to need for that? Well, solar. I mean, solar is already the cheapest form of utility scale generation, period. Solar is already cheaper than gas, oil, nukes, and coal. Today, it's already cheaper. Any investment in coal, gas, capital expenditures, nukes, what am I missing? Gone. You will never recover that money. Solar is already cheaper, new solar, period. Nothing else makes sense from a purely financial perspective. 1.8 cents for solar. Nothing can compete with that. That's total cost. That's no subsidies. 1.8 cents. Nothing else can compete. Today, did I say today? Today, right? And what about dispatchable? Because we only get sunshine during the day, right? Well, most of our consumption is during the day, but nonetheless, we've seen solar plus batteries, 2.3 cents. Already, that's today. 2.3 cents, 2.6 cents. Solar plus batteries. Again, this is cheaper than anything else. Nothing else can compete in large-scale generation. And when we don't need solar, and this is Colorado, Xcel Energy. They put out a request for proposals for 1,100 megawatts, and what came back was about 100,000 megawatts. They wanted 1,000, but 100,000 came back in request for proposals. And look at the numbers. Solar plus wind plus storage under 3 cents. This is not subsidized, people. And this is in Colorado, way north of here. 3 cents, wind, solar, and batteries. Essentially 24/7. We don't need anything else. For purely economic reasons, by the way. Not because you care about climate or whatever. It's pure economic reasons. So let me wrap it up. It's 2018, almost 2019, and we're here. I mean, essentially, we're driving typewriters on wheels. And if you don't know what a typewriter is, I've made my point, right? Our whole energy and transportation infrastructure is one massive typewriter on wheels. And we're on the cusp, essentially. We're almost there at the tipping point where the combination of batteries, electric vehicles, self-driving, ride-hailing, and solar, plus wind, are going to blow away everything else. It's over by 2030, but the financial collapse of the dirty energy industries coming in the early 2020s, financial, but the whole market penetration is pretty much going to be over by 2030. And I'll leave you with this thought. This is not, as some have painted it, an energy transition. This is a technology disruption. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
The question and answer session?
Yes.
Let's start with technology.
Yes.
The first question from Fernando Gonzalez is, what is your vision in the use of hydrogen in internal combustion engines? Will EV skip this technology, or could it be this time be just the electric power production only be used for the hydrogen?
Yeah, hydrogen makes no sense. None, zero. Space, yes, but for on-the-ground land transportation, hydrogen makes exactly no economic sense at all, zero. I mean, I've looked at it up and down, and it doesn't make any sense. Hydrogen is a little bit like clean diesel, right? Or agricultural biofuels and so on and so forth. It's at that end.
What is happening with fast charging requirements for all the vehicles? There's one question, and the other is, what is your prediction on blockchain technology and your views on fusion energy?
Yeah, so let me start with the easy one. Fusion energy is 30 years away and has always been, right? When I went to university, to MIT in the 80s, it was 30 years away, and it was very exciting that it was 30 years away, and it still is. So it'll come at some point, but I would not bet the house on when it happens. Essentially, all of this disruption will have been, it's over with, right? So I'm not saying that it can't happen, it probably might, but in terms of a disruption or in terms of something that will make any difference at all within the next 10 or 20 years, I don't see fusion happening. I mean, I've kept in close touch with many fusion companies, startup companies, as well as large companies, and it still needs 5-6 miracles, and by definition, you can't predict the miracle. By that I mean breakthroughs. Yeah.
Una pregunta en español.
Sorry, I didn't answer all the questions,
Okay.
right? Charging. Essentially, if you've looked at some of the latest technology, Porsche just announced that their 15-minute charging technology is already out. So the next, I forget what the new Mission E is going to come out with 15-minute charging. So, the idea that charging is going to, again, take overnight and it's going to be slow and you need a massive infrastructure. Technology is also improving exponentially. And part of the mythology is that the charging infrastructure is going to take a lot of money and time and so on and so forth. the way that I see it, the government should not be involved in charging infrastructure. You should let the market do it. You should let Uber do it. You should let Tesla do it. You should let VW do it. But and they are selling EVs. Let them build the charging infrastructure. So this is the government should enable it. Should from a regulatory perspective, it should make it easy for this to happen, not clog it up in red tape and so on. But let Uber do it. I mean, let them invest in their infrastructure.
Tony, hay varias preguntas. Algo que no se dijo es que Tony nació en Venezuela, de manera que habla perfectamente español. Y por eso le voy a hacer estas preguntas en español, un poco para que practique español. Si has revisado con cierta profundidad el comportamiento del tráfico, especialmente en términos del número de pasajeros que se requieren desplazar, parece ser, pregunta Luis Álvarez, que los ahorros en tráfico no necesariamente son lineales, sobre todo si hay pool riding, ¿no? Si no existe pool riding. Y esto viene algunas otras preguntas relacionadas con transporte masivo, en términos de costo, ¿qué se requerirían de mejoras o de cambios en la infraestructura para lograr una convergencia total? ¿Y qué se requeriría a un país como México, por ejemplo, para que pudiésemos hablar de esta disrupción en el transporte de pasajeros y en el transporte de carga?
¿Cuántas preguntas hay? ¿3 o 4?
Sí.
Ok. Que sí entiendo el español, pero no conozco la terminología, ¿no? O sea que voy a contestar en inglés o Spanglish. Which one is the first one? The infrastructure? Traffic.
The one that was traffic.
Yeah, so traffic, like I said, so traffic is non-linear. It's one of those non-linear phenomena. You have an on-ramp, and basically that car is going to clog up a whole highway because of one car that is ramping in, and so you can see that every day. So with the task disruption, like I said, you're going to have 80% fewer vehicles on the road. So there are several dimensions. One is because we don't need parking, we can get rid of all the waste in space that we use for parking today. So you get 2 lanes back. Then you're going to have 80% fewer cars. So you have more road without more investments, fewer cars. Now those cars are going to be driving around, right, all the time. And when you have some sort of autonomous vehicle technology, level 3 or 4, those cars drive a lot better than humans already. And there have been studies that say that just 5% cars being autonomous can improve traffic by up to 40%. 40%, just 5% of the cars. Why is that? Because we're distracted, we look around, we drink, we eat, we blah 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 in the car. We also leave a lot of space between cars and sideways also. So that's again a massive waste of space. So you have that combination, and also imagine that these cars are computers on wheels, and they have access to ways for self-driving cars, right? So they have a view of the whole city, and essentially in real time. So combine all of these things, the fact that fewer cars, no parking, basically they drive better than humans. They don't go stop and go and stop and go, and they have a view of the whole city, so they can get around traffic with, before even looking at anything. Essentially, traffic is gone. No traffic because of this convergence, essentially. And so if your business model is based on, for instance, basically bridges and charging cars, basically you should look for an out. So yeah, traffic is essentially gone because of all of these things, not any one. So in terms of what new infrastructure, I mean, most of the infrastructure that we need essentially can be and should be financed by private industry. These are autonomous vehicles. And by definition, autonomous vehicles should drive themselves in parking lots, should drive themselves in highways, should drive themselves pretty much everywhere. They have sensors that can see 30 centimeters in front and 100 meters in front and 100 basically 360 degrees. So in a way, they're superhumans. They're going to talk to one another. Now, we are going to have 5G soon, but 5G is not necessary. And that caveat. It'll be used just like we use 4G and we're going to use 5G, but it's not a necessary condition for autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles can talk through waves, through lasers and radars, and so on and so forth. So essentially what the California Highway leadership says that we need today is to paint the roads. Does this make sense? Pintar las autopistas, okay? Because the autonomous vehicles, for now, as they're trained, they need to, as they're building a high definition mapping infrastructure, okay, which is a centimeter by centimeter view of the whole city. So you need high definition mapping. The government could do the high definition mapping so that it's open to everybody. But if not, companies are doing it on their own anyway. Just like companies, there's Google Maps and there's Apple Maps and so on and so forth. Companies are doing it and then they're licensing it to each other and so on. So it's a good business model. The problem with that is that it makes it hard for new entrants into the space. And as a government, you want open systems, you want open data, you want essentially to lower the barriers to entry so that, two UNAM students in an apartment here can start a new company, and that company can become Google or Apple and so on. And what you need to do, just like what happened with the web 20 years ago, you need to lower the barriers to entry so that anybody can develop a new product or service and plug into the existing infrastructure. So from a government perspective, you want regulations that say we want open data, we want open systems, we want things to be shareable and so on and so forth. But high definition mapping is not expensive either. In a city the size of Mexico City, 20 million people?
Yeah. 20
million people, just ballpark idea, would be $30 million. How much is 1 kilometer of highway, right? This is mapping the whole city. But again, I think that it should be left to the market to do this. So most of the infrastructure can be done by companies whose best economic interest is to have that infrastructure. And this includes charging, this includes high definition mapping, except for painting the highways, which probably should be done by the government. But other than that, most of it should be done by private industry, whose best economic interest is to do that. But the government should change regulations to make it easy for this to happen. One of the things that I would do is I would give individuals and companies the right to generate electricity, to store electricity, and to sell electricity. The right, not without, just like today, we all have the right to plug into, for instance, Facebook, into Twitter, and we have the right to information, right? We can sell it, we can buy information, we can, and so on. We can make things and sell them, but for some reason, we can't make electricity or sell electricity. Doesn't make any sense. 100 years ago, it did, because it was a natural monopoly. But now it doesn't make any sense at all. Now, generating my own energy with solar is actually cheaper than what I buy from the utility. So I should be able to do it. So one of the things I would do is give companies and organizations and individuals the right. And what that means is a flip in the way that we see energy and transportation. Basically, anyone with an EV should have the right to power their own house with their electric vehicle. And by the way, this technology already exists. I mean, after Fukushima Daiichi, when there was rationing in Japan, a lot of folks went to Nissan and said, can I buy a Leaf to power my house? And Nissan developed that technology. So essentially, it's fairly easy, but in most countries, it's not legal to power your house with your own EV. Why not? And by the way, I should be able to sell to my neighbor or sell back to the grid. Now, it should not be at predetermined prices. It's an auction, just like eBay. Let the market work. If electricity is expensive, then maybe I'll sell more than I'll consume. If it's cheap, then maybe I'll store it, right? But allow, just like we have a market for information, you should allow for a market in energy. And in doing that, the government can do several things at the same time. One is allow for private industry to invest in risk. The government should not take the risk in doing this. And B, competition will drive down costs, right? Because when everybody can generate their own electricity, essentially let the market for electricity work. Having said that, there are two pieces where it's going to be hard to have competition. One is transmission. You can't have competition. So yeah, it's okay to have a monopoly, but even in that case, the rules should be transparent, and you should still have the right to plug in, like we plug in the internet, to sell and buy and so on and so forth. And the other one is distribution within the city. So within the city, we need a distribution, but the business model of distribution should change. So a distribution, basically the poles, they should not produce their own energy. They should essentially have an Uber type of, or Airbnb business model. They should be agnostic to who produces electricity and who buys it. Essentially, they do auctions like eBay all the time. And when you have those, and all of those rules should be transparent and open and well known. That is what you need. Open up the market, just like the market for information services were opened up with cell phones and the internet and the web and so on and so forth. And look at what happened. I mean, long distance calls went from whatever it was 20 years ago, $8 an hour, to free. Free. I mean, my girlfriend comes from Thailand. We dated for a year via FaceTime. Free, right? How cool is that? Free. And that's what happens when you open up the market and you allow basically entrepreneurs and you allow companies to compete. Yeah?
But you have done it, it was not free, right?
Free. Well, no, not now. Yeah. She's not in Thailand anymore. She's with me in San Francisco. Thank you.
A question related to batteries.
Yes.
In your book, you talk about salt batteries, and you
Yes.
mentioned those.
Yes.
And then there is another question I think is very interesting, related to the availability of raw materials, let's say lithium.
Yes.
Because all these rare earths are located in China. So I guess they will have a major player in this game. So
Right.
what do you think about the future of this?
Yeah, so lithium is not a rare earth, right? I mean, lithium is one of the most abundant elements on the crust of the earth. Go to the Atacama Desert in Chile and you'll see lithium forever, right? So lithium is very abundant. What we have in China today is not the lithium itself, is the refining of the lithium. And basically that's manufacturing. You can have that manufacturing pretty much anywhere. But lithium itself, the known lithium, I've seen a number of studies that say we can, do 1 billion cars or whatever using the known lithium. And that doesn't include the unknown lithium that will be discovered, of course, when it's financially, basically certain for companies to make money. And also it doesn't account for improvements in resource utilization. And what do I mean by that? So one of the not rare elements, but one of the elements that I would be concerned about, not lithium. Lithium is very abundant. It's cobalt, right? So cobalt in many batteries is not all batteries, by the way. Most batteries in China are lithium iron phosphate, all of which are very abundant. But Tesla batteries, for instance, are cobalt. And cobalt gives you that extra kick and whatever. But even Tesla used to use 9 units of cobalt 10 years ago. Now they use 1. So they have essentially, as the industry gets better, they go down the learning curve. They learn to use materials more efficiently because it's in their best selfish interest, right? So essentially, for all or most of these resources, we're using them most efficiently, and that's partly why the cost is coming down. And that's partly, for instance, 4 or 5 years ago, why mainstream analysts would say lithium-ion batteries cannot possibly go down at 16%, not possible, and they would take out. Basically they would say, a lithium-ion battery uses this much lithium, this much cobalt, this much whatever, and you can't take this down below what it is. And I'd say, look, that's not the way it's going to be. In 5 years, you're going to use less cobalt, you're going to use less iron, and so on, and that's what's happened, right? You couldn't predict exactly how it was going to be done, because that's part of the learning curve, but essentially we're going to use less. So most of the products, the resources that we need for lithium-ion batteries, except for cobalt, are very available.
There are 3 more questions.
Yes.
One is related to policy.
Yes.
And for countries like are very interested in maintaining their fossil oils and fossil petroleum gas and so forth to be part of the energy matrix, what would be your advice and what would be the consequences of maintaining that kind of policy as opposed to moving to a more cleaner type of technologies throughout the country?
Yeah. Well, essentially, you're building a horse barn. Everybody you invest. So essentially, picture yourself in 1900, right? And assume you're staying with the existing horse infrastructure. Essentially, within 10 years, all of that investment is gone anyway, whether you want it or not. But more importantly, you cannot compete as a country with the old infrastructure. You just can't. So when you have AEVs, for instance, the cost of transport goes down by 10x, right? No company can compete, no country can compete with another country that has the cost of transportation that's 10 times cheaper, period. When the cost of logistics is 10 times cheaper for another country, they will outcompete you, period, right? So it's not about being clean. This is all about cost. No company, no country can compete with the old infrastructure. And it goes for everything. Solar is already 2 cents, right? And below that. You put up a gas plant. Oh, and by the way, I haven't even talked about energy independence, right? Because a lot of money is going to go into importing. And not just money, but the geopolitics of depending on other countries for giving you energy, right? Buying energy from other countries. You know what the geopolitics are. So it's money, it's political dependence, and so on and so forth. When you have an infrastructure that is solar plus wind plus battery plus AEVs, essentially you unlock all that energy from really, really the most abundant energy source on Earth, which is the sunshine, right? And it's going to be also the cheapest. And by the way, your healthcare costs are going to come down I mean, air quality is horrible, right? I can feel it, right? Healthcare costs are going to come down. So a lot of costs are going to come down because you're going to use, but this is an implication, right? The end result is, imagine yourself with a horse infrastructure trying to compete with another country that has a car infrastructure. Now, essentially, we're going to the next level. Gasoline cars are what horses used to be, and AEVs are going to be the next thing. So essentially, it's a competitive thing. The more money goes into the old infrastructure, not only are you going to lose that money because it's going to be disrupted, but you're going to miss out on the new opportunities. I showed that picture of Ford in 1913 with tens of thousands of workers. You're going to miss out on that, right? You're going to have to import all of that technology and so on and so forth. That's essentially the point. That this is not about climate. This is not about pollution. It's about competition. It's about investing in the next wave of technologies that are going to make the country more competitive and generate growth and generate jobs. That's what it's all about.
Just two final questions related to stranded assets.
Yeah.
And, for example, you're talking about the hydrocarbons industry will disappear. Who will pay for shutting the plants and the wells and all the installations? Should the companies pay? For the government pay? Because typically the consumer pays for that through rates and taxes. Who should pay for it?
So,
if Exxon is gone like it is right now, or Pemex is gone like it is right now?
Yeah, that's a good question because a lot of companies that can see this coming, they know it's coming, are essentially, one of the things that you should watch out for is that companies are starting to move those assets, or actually not assets, liabilities, onto the government, onto consumers. And you should watch out for that because what does end up happening is that consumers end up, and taxpayers end up paying their bills. So you should be watching out because that's already happening, that all those liabilities, pensions, for instance, you think you have a guaranteed pension, think again. Make sure that you do, right? And the cleanup of the stranded assets, you should make sure that the company either has the money or at least is insured so that somebody's going to pay for that is not the consumer. So one of the things that are happening now is that to lower their cost, they're loading consumers and taxpayers with those stranded liabilities, not the assets, so that they can take the upside without the downside.
The final question is related to regulatory and ethics issues.
Yeah.
In the case of an own man car, one that one drives, one is responsible for driving the car.
Yes.
When you have an autonomous vehicle car, who would be responsible if something happens, if an accident happens? The guy that pushed the button to start the car, the guy that designed the car, or the computer? And then that has to do also with the regulatory framework.
Yes.
In general. Because for the autonomous vehicle to work, you need to have 5Gs or 4Gs or whatever available.
No, you don't.
And or any other system.
Right.
But who will be responsible of maintaining that? Will be the companies, or the government have to have a role in regulating so that everyone have access? So that means there is a public service in which all these platforms should run, so that they don't be privatized.
Right. No, good question. Autonomous vehicles, like I said, kill cars today. And we're not great drivers, right? We kill 1.3 million people every year. I don't drive, but and we also send 20 to 40 million people to the hospital in traffic accidents every year. It's a catastrophe every year. We're killing 1.3 million people. So the problem is today, it's not in the future. And so what is happening already is that, if you look at the evidence that we're already getting is that many of these autonomous vehicles are already safer than humans, already. And they're improving super exponentially. And So the question that we're going to have actually is the opposite. We're going to have the question of, within a couple of years, 3 years, is that an autonomous vehicle, when it's safer, say by 2 times or 3 times than a human, at which point are we going to ban humans from driving, right? We're going to do it, right? So what is going to end up happening is that insurance costs for humans, because we're such bad drivers, are going to go up, are going to skyrocket. And that is going to be another contributor to essentially that's a part of the negative feedback loop of the basically individual ownership model, because we're so dangerous, costs are going to keep rising. So gasoline stations are going to shut down. So when you charge, when you fuel, it's not going to be 5 minutes down the road. It's going to be an hour down the road, because gasoline stations are going to shut down and so on, which is going to make it more difficult and inconvenient. So insurance costs for humans are going to go up. More humans are going to go into AVs and so on and so forth. And we still have to decide the legal framework for autonomous vehicles, right? Because accidents will happen. Fewer, and at some point none. But in the meantime, we do have need a legal framework. The legal framework is going to be dependent on each society. So in the United States, each state today has a different framework for insurance. I mean, it's not the same thing. And I expect that will be the case in the future for AVs. And each country is going to have its own regulatory framework for AVs also. So yes, the government, not just the government, you, society, we have a role in essentially basically putting together a new regulatory framework for AVs, just like we have for individual ownership. Again, it needs to be open, transparent, so that everybody knows. And by the way, the tests that are done for AVs are not going to be the same ones as we do for individuals. A lot of those tests are going to be in computers, because these are computers on wheels. And in the case of Waymo, the company that I showed, they have done about 10 million miles of road, basically transportation so far, but they have done 10 billion miles in computers, in simulation. And in simulation, you can do a lot more in terms of conditions that you could never have in real life. I mean, you could throw an elephant in the middle of the highway. In some countries, actually, it is possible, but probably not here. But and see what the car does. I mean, I looked at Baidu. Baidu is the Google of China. They're also doing an autonomous, basically, program. Unlike Waymo, they're totally open. It's open source, so they have dozens, maybe hundreds of companies participating. And I mean, I looked at their simulation, and they have, I think it was 20,000 different types of simulations, scenarios. I mean, what do you do when somebody comes in at this angle? Now, for instance, we look at each other, and what would a computer have? 20,000 cases of being simulated, and humans cannot possibly compete with that. So yes, we need a regulatory framework, and we're also going to need a new one for humans. And what I expect, by the way, is that cars will become, of course, gasoline cars, what horses are now. So I have friends who own horses, and they go out to the racetrack maybe once every 2 weeks. They drive up there, they ride their horses, and then they come back home, right? So those who love driving cars are going to go in their autonomous vehicles, not there, but probably Ubers, drive a car in the racetrack away from people. They're going to come back home, just like with horses.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
quisiera yo agradecerle, por supuesto, lo hago en español, porque al mismo tiempo aprovecho para agradecer al Museo Universum y al director de la Dirección de Divulgación de la Ciencia, el doctor César Domínguez, quien nos hizo favor de prestar las instalaciones para poder tener esta reunión. Y bueno, pues agradecer una vez más al doctor Seba por su tan gentil y tan interesante plática y la posibilidad de contestar todas estas preguntas. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Perdón, antes que
Gracias.
se retiren muy rápido, yo quisiera agradecer al Instituto de Ingeniería, obviamente, por su apoyo y patrocinio a la Alianza para lograr esta conferencia, a LITSA, a DIRAC, a URBA, a PSC, a IPESA, a INESPROC, a ICAFLUR, a GIMSA y a ARCIA, que todos ellos son asociados de la Alianza y que confiaron en que esta iba a ser una conferencia muy exitosa, pero sobre todo muy interesante y retadora. Muchas gracias a todos por haber venido.
Gracias.